Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive? Today we're tackling something way more than just fidget spinners and daydreaming. We're unpacking ADHD.
That's right. We're going beyond the textbook, looking at how it actually affects kids' lives.
Absolutely. Like why some super smart kids struggle in school even though they know all the answers.
Like Elisa from our case studies, bright kid, but her grades.
Totally tanked.
Yeah.
Not because she didn't get the material, but because of all the other stuff going on, those internal struggles ADHD brings.
And then there's the brain stuff, like what's actually happening in a 7-year-old who can't sit still.
Right, like John from the studies.
Exactly. We're going to dig into all of that. We've got research piled high here, DSM-5, cost analysis, those fascinating case studies.
The whole shebang?
Yep. Ready for some, moments?
I am. Lead the way.
Okay, let's start by tackling the biggest misconception head on. ADHD, it's not just about fidgeting.
Right.
Sure, the DSM-5 mentions inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. But what does that actually look like in real life?
Because inattention doesn't really tell Lisa's whole story.
No, not at all.
Remember that incident at her birthday dinner?
Oh, yeah. It wasn't just being rude. That was pure impulsivity. She couldn't help it.
Totally.
And it shows how ADHD isn't one size fits all.
Right off the bat, busting that hyperactive boy stereotype.
Exactly.
I mean, the DSM outlines 3 different presentations, right?
It does, yeah. Inattentive, hyperactive-impulsive, and then combined.
But can kids switch between these, like over time?
They can, and that's what makes diagnosis tricky. It's not always so clear-cut. A kid could be bouncing off the walls one minute, then as a teenager, it's all internal, making it super hard to focus.
Which brings me to my next question. What's happening in the brain? Is it literally wired differently for kids with ADHD?
It's not about faulty wiring.
Okay.
Think of it like this. Construction is happening, but on a slightly delayed timeline.
Okay.
Especially in the frontostriatal region, which is kind of the brain's control center for planning and impulse control. It matures slower in kids with ADHD.
Oh. So their brain's executive function team is still setting up shop while everyone else is off and running.
That's a great way to put it.
Huh.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Some studies show these brains catch up, others don't. So is it just a delay or something more? It's a huge question researchers are still trying to figure out.
Okay, so if the brain is under construction, how much is that blueprint influenced by genes? Are we talking nature versus nurture here?
Genetics definitely have a strong influence. You see it in family and twin studies all the time. Much higher rates of ADHD in biological relatives.
Interesting.
If a parent has it, the child's chances jump to almost 60%.
Wow, that's huge.
It is.
What about specific genes? Have scientists cracked the code and found the ADHD gene?
Not one single gene, no. But there's this one called DRD4 that's super interesting. It's linked to dopamine regulation and sensation seeking.
Okay.
And people with this variation, they tend to be more impulsive, more thrill-seeking. Even how they respond to ADHD meds is different.
So that stereotype of the ADHD kid who's always on the go, could that be linked to their genes needing more stimulation?
It's definitely a piece of the puzzle. But of course, genes aren't the whole story. There's always the question of environment.
Right, like does sugar really make kids hyper? Do food dyes make a difference? Let's debunk some myths. Because I remember that study where it was actually the mom's belief about sugar, not the sugar itself, that made the kids act out. So much for the sugar rush.
Exactly. It shows you how powerful our perceptions can be. Now, food additives are a bit trickier.
Okay.
There's no solid proof they cause ADHD, but for some kids who are already sensitive, they might make symptoms worse.
So not the main culprit, but maybe a contributing factor for some. What about lead? That seems to come up a lot when we talk about childhood development.
Lead is a big concern. Even small amounts can impact those brain areas we talked about, attention, impulse control.
Right.
It's not the sole cause of ADHD, but it can definitely make things worse, especially combined with other risk factors.
Okay, another piece of this complex puzzle. But let's be real for a second. Having a kid with ADHD, it put a lot on parents. Extra stress, right?
Absolutely. Studies show parents of kids with ADHD report much higher stress levels. Some even turn to alcohol to cope.
Wow.
But it's super important to remember, family dynamics don't cause ADHD. They impact how it plays out.
So not about placing blame, but recognizing that home life is another layer of the challenge. I'm also thinking, what if a parent has ADHD themselves? Does that complicate things even more?
It's a great point. That's where this idea of goodness of fit comes in. How well a parent's natural style matches their child's needs can make a huge difference in managing those symptoms.
Like an overly structured parent might clash with a kid who needs flexibility, or vice versa.
Exactly. It's not just about the kid, but that parent-child dynamic.
Fascinating.
It is. So much to consider. And it leads us to another big question. If there's no one-size-fits-all approach, what does work? What are the go-to strategies when it comes to treatment?
Now we're talking. Especially those medications, the pros, cons, the whole debate. Should we unpack that next?
Let's do it. Welcome back. So treatment options, right?
Yeah, let's get into it. But before we do, something you mentioned earlier sparked my curiosity. All those other conditions that pop up alongside ADHD. Like ADHD doesn't like to party alone.
Right, like a package deal.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the most frequent party guests is ODD.
ODD.
Oppositional defiant disorder. Basically, if a child with ADHD struggles with impulse control, a child with ODD is deliberately defiant, easily frustrated, even going out of their way to annoy others.
So it's not just an accidental outburst. There's intention behind it.
Exactly. And it makes parenting extra challenging.
For sure. Dealing with both ADHD and ODD.
It's tough, and unfortunately, it's not uncommon. Researchers think there might be some shared genetic factors or similar environmental triggers.
So it's not that one causes the other, but they might stem from similar roots.
Right, or get amplified in similar environments.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about more serious behavioral issues? Is there a risk of that with ADHD?
There is. Conduct disorder, or CD, is another one we see with ADHD. And this goes beyond defiance. We're talking behaviors that violate social norms, even break the law.
So if ODD is pushing boundaries, CD is crossing the line.
Exactly. Lying, stealing, aggression, that sort of thing. And sadly, kids with both ADHD and CD are at higher risk for things like substance abuse, problems at school, even run-ins with the law. Early intervention is key here.
Wow, so it's crucial to recognize and address those co-occurring conditions, just as important as managing the ADHD itself. But switching gears a bit, you mentioned anxiety earlier. I wouldn't think those two go together. Wouldn't kids with all that energy be, like, fearless?
Not necessarily. Actually, some kids with ADHD experience a lot of anxiety, especially in social situations. Or worrying about tests, even separating from their parents, can be a trigger.
So it's almost like their brains are on high alert all the time, which can lead to both impulsivity and anxiety.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, anxiety can look different in each child. Some might have stomach aches, headaches, others become withdrawn or clingy. It's not always obvious.
That makes me think about diagnosis. How do you tease apart what's ADHD versus anxiety? That seems crucial for figuring out the right treatment.
You're absolutely right. It takes a skilled professional to observe behavior, get input from parents and teachers, and really understand the child's history.
And I imagine treating one could make the other worse if you're not careful. Like giving stimulants to a kid with anxiety. That doesn't seem like a good mix.
You got it. Every child is different, and treatment needs to be individualized. Speaking of unexpected pairings, depression is another one that can occur alongside ADHD.
Really? I would have thought all that energy would prevent them from feeling down.
It's not about physical energy, it's more about the emotional toll of constantly struggling with those ADHD challenges.
Ah, okay. So it's like this feeling of constantly hitting a wall, no matter how hard they try.
Exactly. Kids with ADHD often face criticism for their behavior. They struggle in school, have trouble making friends. It's a constant cycle of setbacks.
And that can lead to feeling hopeless, defeated.
Right. And wouldn't that be extra tough if their parents are constantly getting frustrated too?
Yeah, I can see that.
You've hit on a crucial point. That parent-child dynamic can either buffer those feelings or amplify them. It's why understanding the whole family system is so important.
Right, it's not about blame. It's about creating a supportive environment where the child feels understood. But what about as they get older? Does ADHD just disappear in adulthood?
That's the big question. For some, symptoms do become less severe. They learn coping strategies, find their niche.
So there's hope they can outgrow it, at least to some extent.
There is, but it's not guaranteed. For many, those core challenges, impulsivity, inattention, stick around. They just manifest differently.
So instead of fidgeting in class, it's struggling to hold down a job, being impulsive with money, or relationship problems. The underlying issue's the same, it just looks different.
Exactly, and that's why understanding the long-term impacts of ADHD is so important. Adults with ADHD are at higher risk for all sorts of difficulties: relationship problems, substance abuse, financial instability, even chronic health issues.
Wow, it's not just a childhood phase then.
Nope. It can have ripple effects throughout their whole life. It underscores the need for support, not just to manage symptoms, but to help these individuals thrive long-term.
I agree. And speaking of support, I think it's finally time to tackle those treatment options. Ready to dive into that complex world?
More than ready. Let's unpack what actually works, what's just hype, especially when it comes to those medications that always spark debate. What's the real deal with stimulants?
Let's get into it. Welcome back. We've talked about the symptoms, the challenges, those co-occurring conditions. But what about the root cause? What actually causes ADHD?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And there's no easy answer, unfortunately.
Right.
But we can look at what the research tells us, and the strongest contender is genetics.
Right. We talked about how ADHD tends to run in families, and that some genes might be involved, like the ones related to dopamine. But is there one specific ADHD gene that scientists have found? Like if you inherit this gene, bam, you have ADHD.
I wish it were that simple. Genes definitely play a big role, but it's not a single gene disorder. It's more like a whole bunch of genes, each one contributing a little bit to the overall picture.
So multiple genes, each adding its own little piece to the ADHD puzzle.
Exactly.
And you mentioned some of these genes are involved in regulating dopamine, that feel-good chemical in the brain. What's the connection there?
Well, remember that frontostriatal region we talk about?
Yeah, the brain's control center for planning and impulse control.
Right. Dopamine is super important for how that area functions.
So if the dopamine system isn't working quite right, that could affect those executive functions, the ones that are already developing a bit slower in kids with ADHD.
Exactly. And it's really interesting because the most common ADHD medications, the stimulants, they actually work by boosting dopamine levels in the brain.
Oh, so the fact that those meds can be effective kind of supports the idea that dopamine is involved in ADHD. But genes aren't the whole story, are they? What about all those environmental factors everyone always talks about?
Yeah, there are always those things that people blame, right? Sugar, food additives, too much screen time, things parents worry about.
Okay, so let's debunk some myths. I remember reading about that study where moms were told their kids had a sugary drink,
Uh-huh.
even when they didn't. And guess what? The kids still acted more hyperactive.
It's amazing how powerful our expectations can be. Now, food additives are a little trickier.
Okay.
There's no clear evidence that they cause ADHD directly, but some studies do suggest they might worsen symptoms in kids who are already sensitive.
So not the main culprit, but maybe a contributing factor for some. What about screen time? I feel like a lot of parents are really worried about that these days.
Yeah, that's a big one. Too much screen time can definitely have negative effects on development overall, but there's no solid evidence linking it directly to ADHD. But, managing screen time is always a good idea for all kids, not just those with ADHD.
For sure. So we can cross sugar, food additives, and TV off the list of primary causes. But what about lead? We touched on that earlier, and it seems like a more serious concern.
Lead is a big one. Even small amounts can be toxic to the developing brain, especially those areas we talked about like attention and impulse control. It's not the cause of ADHD, but it can definitely contribute.
So another risk factor to be aware of. And the good news is we can actually do something about it by reducing lead exposure in our homes and communities. But what about the very early years, like even before a child is born? Can anything that happens during pregnancy impact ADHD risk?
Research suggests that it can. Things like if the mother smokes or drinks alcohol during pregnancy, that's been linked to a higher risk of ADHD. Also, complications during birth, like premature birth or low birth weight.
So it's not just about genes, it's also about making sure the developing brain has the healthiest possible environment, both before and after birth. Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room, parenting. I know this can be a sensitive topic, but how much do parenting styles and family dynamics really play into ADHD?
It's an important question, and we need to be really clear here. Parenting styles don't cause ADHD.
Okay, good to know.
But they can definitely influence how the symptoms play out and how the child learns to cope with those challenges.
Right, it's not about blame, but about recognizing that family interactions are a big part of the picture. So are we saying that certain parenting approaches might make ADHD symptoms worse?
It's more about, remember that goodness of fit concept we talked about, how well a parent's natural style matches their child's needs. A super controlling parenting style might create more conflict with a child who really needs independence, for example.
That makes sense. So it's not about being a perfect parent. It's about understanding your child's temperament and finding what works for both of you.
Exactly. It's about creating that supportive and structured environment where the child feels understood and empowered. And don't forget, a lot of parents of kids with ADHD might have ADHD themselves.
Oh, right. Adds a whole other layer of complexity, doesn't it?
It does.
So it's not just about the child, it's about that whole family system and how everything interacts. Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive, from tiny genes to the huge impact of family dynamics and everything in between.
I know, right? It's been quite a journey. We've explored symptoms, debunked those myths, and even looked ahead to how ADHD can affect adults.
And I think the most important takeaway is that ADHD isn't a sign of weakness or bad parenting. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects millions of people.
And while there's no magic cure, there are effective treatments and strategies that can really help. So individuals with ADHD can manage their symptoms, build on their strength, and live fulfilling lives.
It's all about finding the right combination of support, whether it's medication, therapy, parent training, or lifestyle changes, creating a path towards success.
Absolutely. And if you or someone you know is struggling with ADHD, remember, you're not alone. Reach out for support, connect with resources, and advocate for understanding and acceptance. Everyone deserves that.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into ADHD. We hope you've learned some valuable insights and feel empowered to navigate this complex world with more knowledge and compassion. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.